It's totally understandable why a lot of women don't trust the concept of a men's group because they're usually awful together. So I actually want to talk about this a little bit more. Thank you for this comment. So a lot of people, when they think of men's groups, they think of that scene in Fleabag, where it's a bunch of like men with serious problems and a lot of anger issues. But rather than actually dealing with those problems, they all just like hate women, and like hating women or like being in self-pity or seeing themselves as like victims somehow is what bonds them. That is not the kind of men's group I support. In fact, most men's groups I find questionable. There's so many of them out there that are like, find your masculinity, learn how to be a man. Yet all they do is reinforce this binary of like what a man is. What does it mean to be masculine? And actually, one of my mutuals, Dope Dad, has talked about this a lot. I can't find the video, otherwise I'd tag it. About how like a bunch of men going into the wilderness and being like, ah! Like, how is that helping you deconstruct this stuff? How is that helping you become more vulnerable and have close relationships with men? How is doing sports together really connecting you? I'm not saying that those things couldn't be a part of it, but any men's group that's not really about emotional intelligence, dealing with any of their former trauma, deconstructing patriarchy and how it has taught men to think they are literally better than everybody, which then makes them really attached to this idea of dominating people. And then also using violence in order to keep power and all that stuff, right? If they're not like really questioning all that and how they do suffer under patriarchy, but because they benefit from it too, they are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do you really want to give up all this power? Not a lot of men do. It is so much easier for men to come in communion with each other to hate us. In fact, there was a few interviews that were left out of that piece that I wrote. This one I talk about all the time, the one for Harper's Bazaar that went viral. I don't think I've actually ever shared these interviews before, so I'm gonna read a little bit of it now. Because a men's group that is not really dealing with like healing and questioning yourself and vulnerability and emotional intelligence, and also keeps in mind that you cannot exploit your partner in order to go spend time with your men. Like, you can't be working on yourself at the expense of your wife or your kids or whoever. And the only reason that these interviews were left out is because it just came down to word count. That's when you write magazine articles, word count is, well, it is what it is. But it made one of the final drafts. So this woman named Heidi, this 55-year-old woman who didn't want me to give her last name, she had opinions about men's groups because her dad had been to men's groups. He went for 15 years to men's groups, and it did not benefit their family at all because he was unable to connect to the men in an honest way. Her quote, all that navel gazing with other men who were probably as unhealthy as him gave him even more license to justify his selfish, destructive behavior. And then her mom saw his men's groups as something that he would do to avoid hanging out with her. He loved hanging out with his men's group as a reason to avoid his family and his wife that he clearly didn't like. And that kind of ties into why I question a lot of men's hobbies and their obsession, the very time-consuming hobbies. It's one of the things that my article kind of ignited was that men don't have friends. Let's help men have friends. Then all these articles came out about how do we get men to have friends? Let's push them outside the home so they can hang out with a lot of men so they can have friends. No, because who is that? That is at the expense of their wives. Who's going to take all the childcare? Who's going to take care of all the kids while he's out bonding with men? And if the time with men is not intentional, if it is not intentional time to be emotionally vulnerable, it's just literally a bunch of dudes hanging out, it's just more of the same crap. Escapism. Men and their escapism is what destroys so many families and marriages. Then I interviewed a guy, Carl. He did give his last name, but since it didn't go to print, I'm going to not say it just in case. He's a 63-year-old man who lived in Colorado. And he talked about his do-it-yourself men's group that he went to when he was living in Fairbanks, Alaska, because so many men really want this. They want relationships with men. They're desperate for it, but they don't know how to do it. And so they're just kind of trying all these things. And then a lot of men are exploiting that desperation. All these, how do you find your masculine? And I've made videos on this before. A lot of these these men that are obsessed with like the divine feminine and divine masculine are literally all about convincing women to trust men to lead them so that we can just, finally relax because we're tired of running the show and we're being in our masculine. We're not being in our masculine. We're just literally being exploited by men and having to do everything because they won't show up. It had nothing to do with masculinity or femininity. So a lot of men are making a fortune off of men who are lost, alone, and don't know where to go. So this man, Carl, he went to these men's groups. They were all, but none of them had, what did he say? Did not have much depth, insight, or personal growth involved in them. So they didn't work. So yeah, this is the book that my husband used. It's not like strict or whatever, but it just gives them some exercises to start, like, how do we start this group? How do we set up rules to hold each other accountable? How do we help each other feel safe? How do we learn how to be vulnerable? And it gives it, like, I was kind of amazed at some of the activities that I actually looked at this book and used some of it to start a women's group when I was jealous of what he had. Because even though I'm pretty good at building community now, after a long time of being a lone wolf, I have a lot of friendships that are very deep. There's just something about a group, right? Where you get a feedback from several people. It is a different level of vulnerability, and I wanted that. So we didn't have to do all the stuff that book says because, we were approaching it differently. At the end of the day, the whole point of men's groups is for them to stop avoiding themselves, to hold themselves accountable, to have other men who are working on themselves help hold them accountable too. My husband goes to his men's groups for advice on work, advice on me, how to deal with me. I ask my friends for advice on how to deal with him. I've never been married before. I don't know what I'm doing. And I oftentimes need someone to filter things through so I don't say things that are so mean or, just to understand. One of the women in my women's groups is literally a marriage and family counselor, so her advice is always spot on. And you know how like the company you keep really does impact you. So I don't want him hanging out with a bunch of toxic dudes who've never been married, who don't know how to have healthy relationships or, all that stuff. I trust him in the hands of these men. They give him such good feedback, and he can actually hear feedback from them in a way that he can't hear it from me. For instance, he was having issues with his job, and he eventually left for burnout. But I was so tied into his job. My financial security, I'm living with it all the time. I was too close to it. And so at a certain point, my advice was not like, it wasn't good because I would go into my own trigger responses and like fear of the future and stuff. And they all had been through similar experiences, gave them such sound advice. And what they've also discovered is that if they are not dealing with patriarchy in this group and how it plays out, they can go to all the meetings they want to and still end up exploiting their wives without even realizing it. Husband takes the lessons he's learned from me and my content and the things that we've learned the hard way. He takes that to the group. They teach each other. And in fact, one last little tidbit, he actually realized that if he is not deconstructing patriarchy, he can go to all the men's groups that he wants, but he's going to end up putting something on me without realizing it because of the way he was conditioned. And the perfect example was when they went on a men's group vacation, or like not a vacation, but just met up and had like a whole weekend together. He didn't deal with the dog cared. He didn't, think ahead long enough. And I paid the price. And he has been making up for it ever since. He saw in real time what happens even when his motives are to like deconstruct patriarchy and learn, all these things. If he's not thinking about his impact on me, even when doing these things that are healthy for him, what's the point? What's the point? So you better believe now whenever he goes anywhere, he is thinking about who's going to watch the dog, thinking about logistics, travel plans, like all that stuff. And me being codependent by nature, or not by nature, being taught to be codependent, I did a lot of things that I shouldn't have been doing. I should not be coordinating the dog for his trip. But I just stepped in and did it. And then I was like, wait, what am I doing? You should be doing it, We're all unlearning this together. If it's a bunch of men sitting around circle, being like, self-pity, my life sucks, masculinity is so hard on me, or hey, let's go play sports. That's not real intimacy. That's not real friendship. That is not community building. And when men do not have friends in their community, everything that happens to them falls on their wives or their daughters when they're older, or their mothers, sisters, girlfriends, whoever. No men will show up for them when something happens. Anthony is very much aware that one way he can show up in our marriage is to make sure that he has a very solid support system outside of our marriage. That's the point of the men's group.